This is my process for the painting Vampire's Temptation. When I did this, I wanted to convey kind of a Magic the Gathering style card art to create this vampire who's sitting in the chair, kind of tempting you to come towards him. And in the background, I want to do a painting that ultimately is coming to life. And so the first thing I do is I trace this using a projector with a digital file that I hand drawn, and from there I used just a sepia to paint the underpainting. And as you can see, I'm using quite a bit of mineral spirits to thin it out, and just kind of leaving the highlights, like especially the highlights on his skin, really a kind of much lighter tone. And then I'm actually going through with a second pass and creating darker tone values, and this is going to give me kind of a base template to work off of. Now in the end, most of this doesn't show through at all, so ultimately it's extra work, but it gave me a good idea of like the value structure of this particular piece. Now next, I'm putting on simple basic colors, green for the background. I'm going to use reds for the cushions and things like that. So you can ultimately see that I'm just putting in my basic colors. Now I'm using transparency in my paint, so again this is more of a light wash than anything else. And I'm going to again go over it as well, but what it allows me to do is kind of block in the colors really quickly and get a good idea of value tone. I'm not really touching the skin at all at this point because I want to really have that more of a unique tonal value. And so you can see that I'm putting some of the darker blues in there, and then I'm pulling them out with a rag to ultimately get a smoother tone, especially on the pants and things like that. And then I'm using again darker tones for the wood textures, and I'm going to go in and use other values here for the skins. So as I'm painting the skins, I'm pretty much mixing 3 different colors. I'm mixing a light, a mid-tone, and a dark, and what that's going to allow me to do is get a nice value range of going back and forth. This is on a panel board, so it's relatively smooth and I can blend really quickly with that ability. So as you can see, I'm starting out with darker colors, but I'm also blending a little bit on the canvas, and that I think helps me out quite a bit. Now as you can tell, this is sped up quite a bit, so going through and putting in more highlights. I'm basically adding in lighter versions of the fabric and other elements of that sort. And the one thing I struggled with in this was ultimately there was just a lot of little details that I wanted to put in. And so I'm kind of mixing the point between painting and actual like little details and things like that. And so you can see like this chair, I don't actually have that chair, no matter how much it would be cool to have. I don't have that chair, so I'm actually trying to think of the value changes that would actually happen in real life, and it's a little bit harder than you think. You can kind of come up with the basic idea, but there would be a lot more cast shadows and things like that I just didn't put in there. I'm going through the fabric now and making it much more vibrant red. I really want the red and the blue to kind of contrast each other, especially that warm and cool, and I think that's going to cool down his skin tone as well. And again, I'm just putting base colors at this point with a little bit of highlight. You'll notice later on I'm going to go through and actually darken a lot more, put a lot more darker elements in there. So as I continue to paint, basically I'm just adding in more and more detail. Now the body with this with the seated figure is very easy to do. I'm working from a photo, and it ultimately is relatively simple, step by step. But what gets harder and harder is to like kind of change the value structures of things. You'll notice that, you know, I'm keep pushing the darks, and I'm going back and referencing the photo on the iPad there, and I'm ultimately kind of pushing things back and forth. I'm going in and adding finer details and a little bit more dark to add more detail to the pants. I didn't want those pants to be super black. So ultimately a lot of that is just, you know, going back and forth and like pulling in paint and pulling back and forth paint. Now, as I worked on this, I wanted the painting and the paint on the back wall there to be a little bit more kind of defined. And again, I'm going through and kind of overlaying another solid color. I'm using a little bit more painterly strokes. I'm not trying to smooth it out, and I'm kind of adjusting things because the shadows underneath from the easel is basically giving me some issues. So I'm going back and forth and kind of adjusting light. Same thing here, going through the background and ultimately painting the dark colors. Now I'm trying not to use black in this. I'm using a mix between a red and a blue to really kind of give me a dark purple for most of the blacks. And that's going to give me a little bit more sedimentary kind of solid fill of that. When I add a black, it usually just overpowers that particular color. So that's a huge aspect that I kind of try to avoid. Again, going back, painting base tones for the monster. I should have taken a little bit better photo reference for this, but I didn't. So I'm just kind of working from what I see visually. I think he even grabbed one of the little action figures just to get the highlights and the shadows in the right spot. And then as I work, I'm basically going through, and at this point I've got most of the colors in except for the human figures and the tentacles. And what I'm doing is I'm just trying to keep those balanced back and forth. I don't want to have that painting more powerful than the main figure. So I'm trying to, even though they're very saturated, I'm trying to kind of keep those set up and ready to kind of fall into the background. Now, as you can see here, I'm ultimately just going through, and it's a lot of little details. I've got the main body of the paint in there, and I'm just kind of pushing in highlights and pulling back things. Ultimately, what that's doing is that's giving me a good structure of like back and front, and kind of pushing that in there. One of the main issues I was having with this painting is the frame was kind of getting crooked. And so at some point in time, you'll see me use some painter's tape to basically mask it and create a straight line. But ultimately, I'm just adding in little highlights here and there, and then going through and adding in more and more details. I'm letting the painting dry between sessions so that I can work on top of that old paint and kind of, you know, build up those potential areas. Now you can see I'm working in the detail here for the figures, and I didn't have, you know, anybody pose like this. What I actually found were some basically drawings of, you know, actual figure drawings, and so I kind of equated those into like real life poses. And so I used a number of different pieces of photography to kind of emulate the stuff in the background. And in all reality, I should have gotten much more closer photography, but it's one of my failures, I think, as a artist, is I just never have enough reference. So I'm always kind of struggling to put together the painting in the end, and so that's one of my downfalls. It's a lot of in-betweens and kind of forcing myself to get better photo reference in the beginning so I can get a better painting in the end. Ultimately, though, this kind of process is just, I'm not used to painting traditionally. It's not like digital where I can go back and forth and just kind of add things in there. So again, I'm adding blues because most of the background is blues, and I'm kind of adding in, you know, lighter figures. And so what I'm trying to do here at this point is ultimately create more of a painterly effect in the painting itself. And you'll notice that I'm not quite that great with the painterly effect yet. I find that the life drawing I do kind of helps promote that a little bit more. I'm finding the life drawing is really pushing my oil painting skills. Oil painting, in my opinion, is much more about problem solving than anything else, especially live work. It's really about how you solve the problems that come towards you. And so again, I'm doing a lot of detailing here. It's ultimately just kind of going back and forth with the brush and painting just highlights and shadows and trying to push the form a little bit more. And you'll notice again, I'm using a very small brush. I'm using a lot of layers in this to basically create and paint. I'm also kind of going through and pulling stuff back and forth. So I'm trying not to do the hard brush stroke. And at this point in my oil painting knowledge, a lot of it is more of the technical apply paint. I'm not really fluent with oil paints as a whole, so not learning the aspect of like blending things together or hidden edges and things like that. I'm really working directly off of that photograph, and that's fine, but I need to take the artist kind of implementation to add in a little bit more hidden edges, especially in areas where like the pants leg on the corner of the chair blends with the shadow. So I should be pulling those areas back and forth. And I'm ultimately just, that's where I'm struggling with the most is those areas. And I'm going back and forth and adding highlights and doing detail and stuff like that. And it's fine for what I'm doing now. But as I keep going, I notice like things aren't looking properly. I'm running into areas where I need to go in and kind of refine the edges and kind of add in elements that I didn't think about. Like right now I'm adding in a picture frame, and so I went and found kind of some fancy frame that I can buy and kind of work in there. Now, is that necessarily the best frame to work off of? Probably not. I could probably find something a lot more interesting out there. But at this point, I'm just trying to get the painting done because I feel like I've spent too much time noodling around with, the little details. So at this point, I'm working on getting things to have proper lines, and I'm stuck with straight lines right now. So what I'm doing is I'm using tape to draw straight lines for the trim, and I'm kind of going in and looking at areas where I think they need more work. Like the foot felt flat to me, so I went in and pushed in a little bit more detail in the foot, and I added a little bit of detail into the kind of figures and things like that. And a lot of it is just little things to just kind of push the highlights. Like here I'm just adding a little bit of highlights to the tentacles, to the figure, and I'm smudging in some things just to kind of push them back and forward. I even pushed in some of the colors backwards so that the male figure pops a lot more. I'm trying to bring more attention to that and create more detail and more focus over there than to look at the painting. The painting should be like my secondary focus. And so when I'm doing this, I'm really trying to push and get more details in the throne, in the figure, in the pants than I do in the painting, because I want people to look at the painting at the second part of this. And again, using masking tape to just kind of add in edges and kind of push things out a little bit more. I'm just trying to, again, get the kind of elements in there and kind of press that a little bit more. So I hope you like this. Ultimately, if you guys have questions or you want to pick my brain, feel free to ask questions. I'm more than willing to kind of share my knowledge and let you know what I know. All right, I hope this helped, and I hope you enjoyed it. Have a good day.